VenomousStare back with another StarCraft 2 first-person VOD. This time we have a Venomous Classic on deck for you today. This is going to be a finals of a tournament, a full best of 7 between two of America's best players. Select, who played for Dignitas in the top left. He was really the main player of Dignitas, and you didn't really see a lot of other Dignitas pro gamers for StarCraft 2. Obviously they had the League of Legends team with I Will Dominate and I'm a Cutie Pie and Skara that was very popular. But as far as Dignitas StarCraft goes, as far as I can recall, it was mainly Select, who was very good from mid-2010 when the game came out to about the end of 2011, which this is mid-2011. This is the ASUS Stars invite. It was an invite-only 8-man tournament. But Huck was there, Elfie was there, Damaga was there, IdrA was there, obviously. So this is a pretty solid little LAN where they invited 8 top-tier players and let them duke it out. There were a lot of events like this in 2010 through 2012. And I think that some people sort of disingenuously look back at that era in a negative way and say, oh, well, like I was watching GSL and Tasteless said, he referred to this era as back when there were like too many events. And there were a lot of events, and certainly if you wanted to see good live StarCraft, there was no shortage of that. But a lot of events like this were sort of lost in translation. So we see a proxy Rax here for Select, and this is a Maka Rax. Maka was a Terran player in the GSL who would love to proxy his second barracks in a weird spot to disguise his bunker rush. And this is definitely the Maka play. So Select scouts in, sees the pool, he says, okay, thank God he's not going pool first. I'm going to try to get the bunker down and rally with my main barracks because we got close by ground positions. A lot of these maps, Blizzard made it where you couldn't get close by ground positions. So they got close by air, which makes them sort of close by ground. It makes rushes like this really powerful, way more powerful than if they had spawned cross. So IdrA's going to get his first Overlord focus down, and look, he gets supply blocked there. So for about the next 20 seconds, the most crucial time when it comes to Zerg being able to make stuff to hold this rush, IdrA's supply blocked, and he really needs to hold the spine if he wants any chance of winning. IdrA is in a terrible position as one of the bunkers finishes, and another bunker starts to get up here, and Select is starting to focus the spine, throwing the SCVs in there, which is very intelligent, and IdrA GG's, we're on to game 2. Okay, so this game we're going to be watching from IdrA's point of view, and I will have the link to StarCraft 2 POV's channel in the description. I asked him if I could use some of his VODs for the Venomous Classic series because he likes IdrA too, and I thought this was a really interesting series, and he said yes. And he doesn't have very many subscribers. He's sort of underappreciated, so I thought it would be a nice way to showcase his channel. IdrA here looks as though he is going to send his second Overlord out at his natural. This is something that you see a lot. This is something we saw last game. And you know, whenever I first started to play this game, it was around this time, and I started with Zerg. And I would always see players do this where they would send the second Overlord out to the natural against Terran. This is obviously to look for proxies. But one thing that got me is anytime they would 2 racks, the same thing that happened to IdrA in game 1 would happen to me. The Overlord gets too far out there when the 2 racks hits. You get obliterated by the Marines because you lose the Overlord, and then you don't have the ability to make lings when you really need to, and you die to the 2 racks. So I just think it's sort of an interesting little thing to send the first Overlord out to your natural. Hatchery first here for IdrA. So if we Consider what happened last game. Select went for an aggressive play, the Maka Racks. It's a 2 racks variant. And I think whenever a build like that is done, you really have to think about and talk about maps at this time. And I think this is a really interesting element of StarCraft 2 that doesn't get talked about enough. So map balance early on in StarCraft 2 was extremely Terran favored. The maps were very claustrophobic, they had lots of ramps, they were extremely tight, and you often could spawn right on top of your opponent, which was just terrible for Zerg. I want you to consider that in Wings of Liberty, Zerg had way less options creatively. They didn't have nearly as many options that made close range and close quarters as useful. There was no Ravager and no Lurker, which was absolutely brutal for a very long time. Remember, this is in 2011, so this is sort of out of the beta and Grug Brain 2010, where Terran players would try to just stem up the ramp and hope Protoss players would miss force fields, and things were just very rudimentary. This is 2011 where people have their shit together. And speaking of shit, IdrA just had an oh shit moment because he scouted both the bases where Select could be and he wasn't there, and he was like, well, is he at the freaking gold? And he was. So he saw no gas, so Select is almost certainly going to do another Marine rush here. IdrA throws down a spine, he sees the SCVs, he has a sinking feeling in his chest as he makes 8 Lings. And the Lings are going to come out here as another bunker rush is going to commence. And the SCVs surround the spine. When there's that many workers, it makes it very hard for the spine to finish. Lings around the back. IdrA could try for a flank here. He pulls the drones, pulls the Lings. And both of the pathetic 3-range queens attack. That was another reason why Zerg was at a disadvantage early on in the game's life. And IdrA can pull his drones away, as he has pretty much held this rush, or so he thinks, because the spine is going to come up, and that bunker I do not think will be in range of the hatch, and even if it is, IdrA can just make a bunch of Lings and overwhelm it. IdrA does have a few more workers than Select, but Select is mining at the gold, and IdrA's going to come down with Lings here. It looks like he's going to attempt it at least. I think that was just a little bit of a meat sponge to let his spine get up. So now IdrA can't really rendezvous drones down to his natural, and Select can be obnoxious and try to run into his main, but the rush has sort of stalled out here. This was back when mules stacked with the gold buff bonus, of the gold base buff bonus, so Terrans could mule gold bases and get an insidious amount of money. The one other famous game is we see no speed here for IdrA, which is just insanely brutal. He didn't have a chance to mine gas because he was having to make spines and extra Lings to defend the 2 racks, or I guess in this case it's 3 racks, but to me the word 2 racks is sort of synonymous with just bunker rush. But the other most famous game on this map where a Terran immediately floated to the gold, because that is the base that he spawned in with, folks. He didn't like make a fast expand there. Is a Marine King versus Hey Pro at an MLG, where Marine King, who is famous for doing weird little goofy stuff like this, floated over to the gold and decimated Hey Pro with it. Hey Pro was this guy on Team Liquid that I would argue was one of the least liked Team Liquid players, and it's not like he was a bad person, but if you just look at Team Liquid and consider you had Sheth and TLO and Genro, as IdrA is going to come out and finally surround these bunkers, as he has a ton of Lings and Select just GG's. So Select, for the reason of he's sitting there and saying how many IdrA, the only reason IdrA could run down is he was saying to Select, how many freaking Marines could you possibly have still being on one base, pulling all those SCVs and only having 3 racks? Even on the gold base, like, can you really fill 3 bunkers, and do you have the SCVs to repair? Plus, when you don't have speed, your options are really limited. Whenever you have a bunch of lings, and IdrA couldn't really tech up. He wasn't going to start mining gas when he couldn't transfer workers from his main to his natural. So game 3, the series tied 1-1, best of 7. One of the reasons I chose to cast this game in the Venomous Classic series is A, because it's an IdrA game, and you know IdrA's my favorite player for those of you who have been following this channel. And these two players have history. IdrA won one of his first main StarCraft 2 accomplishments, MLG DC 2010. Lots of good foreigner players there. That is the event, I believe, where Huck wore his infamous Ghosts hoodie. And IdrA defeated Select in the finals, and the very final game was actually played on this map. Select moved out for a big marine tank push, and IdrA crushed it. And I remember at the end of that event, Select was lamenting in interviews that there just aren't any good Zergs on the North American server. And I'm not really prepared to play against someone of IdrA's caliber, as he throws down what you would like to call the QXC bunker, was something that it was colloquially known as at this time. And this was a popular play because for a long time salvage granted you 100% of your investment back. So Terran players could virtually attempt bunker rushes for no risk at all. Obviously you could cancel the bunker for next to no cost, but if you pull 2 SCVs you're going to get that down pretty much no matter what. And you can just wreak havoc on Zerg's life. And then if they commit a lot to busting it, exit your bunker and salvage and retain all the cost. That was one thing that made Zerg's life a living hell. Another thing that we saw a lot of in the Grugbrain era that I was referring to of 2010 through about, I would say, like February of 2011. So the game came out in July of 2010, late July. So that's for about 8 months of the game's life. And you have to include the beta, which I think released in like February or March. So the beta was actually a really impactful time on this game's life, because StarCraft 1 had been grinded by top tier pros for 10 years. So whenever StarCraft 2 beta came out, it gave the B tier players as well as just a plethora of foreigners something really to look forward to. As we see on the wide open Xel'Naga Cavern, Select is going for an in-base CC first, and not CC first, but fast expand with Hellions. And to me, this is a weird play because it's very hard to expand on this map. Select will have to be very careful with his Hellions. He can't sort of have his head up his ass and lose them. So he's getting stim. And obviously he's going into bio. This is just a very common play. One thing about Xel'Naga is how ludicrously open the natural is. Select is going to come in here. And this is one thing that you couldn't do now that you could do then. Queens at this point had 3 range and much less anti-air range. I don't remember what the number is. In this last patch in 2020 here in April, or I guess in April 31st it was released, or April 30th. It was a patch that decreased the Queen anti-air range, which is sort of funny because the only reason that got buffed is because Terrans were doing these ludicrously abusive Liberator builds, where Blizzard was designing the maps in such a way where Terran could siege up in spots where you couldn't get to their Liberator with your Queen, even if there was nothing blocking the corner. So Terrans could just rush out a couple libs, and especially like with the proxy, this would often happen, and just shut down mining your natural for a long time. Queens pretty much have been buffed as a result of Terran ridiculousness, as we see 6 Hellions try to run in here, and on Xel'Naga Caverns, it does make it a good map for Hellions, the same reason that it makes it hard for Terrans to maintain their natural, because the more wide open it is, that means it's good for Zergling pressure, but it also means it's good for Hellions. At a certain point, if you're a Terran or a Protoss player, on a choke like this, you sort of have to say to yourself, I'm going to commit a lot to this early on, and I'm going to pretty much go all in on holding my natural. I know these games are really old, and I'm not going to try to nitpick too much, but I think one thing we can do is compare and contrast these games somewhat to modern games, or at least look at specific things that were done then that have sort of evolved and been improved upon. Because you have two schools of people. A, you have your old head who probably doesn't even really watch the game anymore, that will say, oh, well, the games in 2010 and 2011 were just so much better. Which isn't true. The games now are more high quality, they're more interesting, the players are playing more how they should, they're making less mistakes. And then you have your person who would say, well, what's the point of watching an old game, even like a month-old game? Like, I want to know, like, what's biggest and best. Like, I need the latest, like, gimmick build to use on ladder. And to me, I'm a person who is so interested in StarCraft 2 that I want to catalog these historical games. I want to make a VOD of the incredible games that IdrA played throughout his career especially. I want to make sure that there is a copy of these games online, because you have channels randomly being deleted by YouTube. You have people who will delete their channels for personal selfish reasons like Husky StarCraft, and anytime you can back these VODs up, it's very important. That's part of why I'm shouting this guy's StarCraft 2 POVs out and linking his channel in the description, is because I love what he does. What he's doing is a bare bones approach to what I'm trying to do with the Venomous Classic series. And the Marine Hellion push is going to come in here, clear creep, kill the Lings on the rocks that IdrA was trying to clear. Remember, pretty much all the maps at this time had rocks on the third or leading to it, and Select will kite away and kill all the bands. And there's always that awkward moment in a Terran push where the Terran is kiting, and then the Zerg suddenly runs out of bands and awkwardly has to retreat, and then the Terran, who has been kiting for so long, suddenly surges forward, as we see it again here. Love the use of the Hellions on the low ground, and since IdrA failed to clear those rocks, you could see he was trying, but Select hit a pretty crisp timing. Since those rocks are there, he pretty much doesn't have a chance to hold his base. IdrA doesn't. Just a really sharp timing here from Select. But if I'm going to nitpick, I would say that those depots that are just south of his main CC, he should have started putting those out at his natural. He has 3 depots by his man. To me, that's just a bad habit of Terran players in general. It's not Select specific, and I think they still do it. As we see, a puny little army here gets caught out on the map, and there is no boost back in this time, so Terran players really were punished more for moving out on the map. I think boost players, and drop play rather, because of the boost, is just exceptional in the modern day game. If you're good with the medevac and good with multi-prong drop harass, if you can macro just even on a mediocre level, that's going to bring you a long way as a player. A couple of the mutas are going to die as IdrA was not really paying attention, and he was trying to run in bans to Select's natural, and he did kill a few SCVs, but he didn't really need to micro to that extent. Bane counterattacks, the big beauty of them is you just right click them in a lot of the time. And you might be saying, oh well, VenomousStare, he had a tank there. Well, the tank would have just splashed all the Banes and killed them anyway. You really have to focus on muta retention. As IdrA once said regarding his early leave in that game versus MMA on Test Bug, he said muta retention is everything, ZVT. And you know what? He said that about like this exact era of the game, like within a couple months of that quote was when he was referring to this exact metagame pretty much. In other words, whenever you're playing against Terran, you can't sloppily lose mutas or have a bunch of mutas in the red when they attack. That's pretty much why IdrA said he left against MMA. That was one of the defining factors of the game was, oh well, all of my mutas were low. And IdrA still on 2 base here, we believe, and even if he took a third, he's just now retaking it, and as a PF is coming up, Select will run away and avoid all the splash damage, and IdrA's going to GG there. So that might seem perplexing at first, and anytime IdrA leaves a game, a lot of veteran viewers' first reaction might be, well, why the hell did IdrA leave? Like, did he do a typical IdrA and early leave? No, his third was, like I said, his third was dead. And whenever his third died, he pretty much lost any ability he had to come back on that map. Because as much as in the early game I talked about, well, the IdrA can put on pressure here with Lings. On some level, if the Terran player opens Hellions and makes a lot of Hellions and is careful with them, they can take their natural. They really just have to SimCity from the base of that choke and run it down to their command center. And I think that is one thing that is worth noting on a lot of these maps where sorry about that. A lot of these maps where it seems as though a lot of these maps where it seems as though it's impossible to wall, what a lot of people will end up doing is just walling from the ramp down to their base. Why is it fucked up now? There we go. Sorry, I recently upgraded to Windows 10. I was using 7, which I loved for like a decade, but I finally upgraded to 10 and I'm not as familiar with all the little innuendos. It's a little bit more gimmicky and finicky than 7. I don't really like it as much. But I have everything in the start menu pretty much minimalist as can be, and I've just tried to make it as much like 7 as possible. Thank God it's nowhere as bad as 8. There's always someone really mad about me not talking about the game, when, I mean, just use your eyes. It's not an audio book. You see the production tab, the same shit happens at the beginning of every game. A Reaper is coming out though, and it looks like Select might try to get a bunker down. There's this really annoying spot behind the mineral line of the natural, and it's good for Reapers because the behind the mineral line spot of the natural, it's so exposed, and oftentimes if a Terran will spawn, for instance top right in this case, then the Terran will do a parade push on that bottom part, and they'll run up and down that little cliff where we see right there where the Reaper's going. They'll siege tanks up there, God forbid even put bunkers down there, it can be rough. But this is cross positions Tall Dream Altar for IdrA here, so this is exactly what he wants. This is perfect for a macro player. What Select wants is to be spawning in top right and thinking like, I'm gonna make 3 tanks or 2 tanks with a bunch of bio and push that bottom part and siege IdrA's natural as he's trying to take a third. Excuse me. And maybe I'll do something weird in the early game to limit his creep. One of the main reasons the game was bad for Zerg early on was because of the fact that it was very hard for Zerg to scout, and it was way harder for Zerg to defend. So what I mean by that is the Overlord was significantly lower than it is by default, and you had to have layer to get Overlord speed. Furthermore, the Queen, as I was mentioning before, had way lower air and ground range. And creep was worse because you couldn't put it on ramps, and these old maps are pretty much all ramps, some of them. So IdrA is spreading out his creep. One thing that pretty much no Zergs did back in this time, that a lot of Zergs are doing now, is spreading a couple tumors in your main and just getting all of your base creeped, even the edges, so you see any drops that come. You see some Zergs doing this now. What a lot of Zergs didn't do back in the day that they really needed to do, that is pretty much essential now, is just connecting your main and natural with creep. Remember, a lot of these maps were really small and cutthroat, and a lot of Zergs felt like they just had to get that first inject, and they didn't feel like they could squeeze another queen into their build for creep. Because queens were way less useful overall, you have to consider that it was much harder to tell a Zerg who was on a tiny map or facing the prospect of close by ground positions to squeeze a queen into their build. Now, in the Grugbrain era, from like, 2010, when the game, from the beta, because you might as well include the beta because that was peak Grugbrain, from the beginning of the beta to like February of 2011, you could spawn in close positions on 4-player maps. So, like middle left on Metalopolis to top left. There's a famous game that IdrA played against OGS Hyperdub, where Hyperdub does like the 5 racks Reaper cheese against him. I was thinking about casting that one because IdrA calls him a cheater at one point, and it's funny. IdrA Scouts see the natural. A lot of times whenever you're playing against aggressive players, it's just nice to like confirm like, okay, he is in fact expanding. Hypothetically, if the bunker had been a little further up or a few more units had been up there, you would have had to think to yourself a little bit like, is he hiding information and really like has a bunker out there faking an expansion and he's really all-inning? Now Tal'Darim Altar was actually a pretty solid macro map just because of how big it is. To go back and play on it, I don't really like it. The 4 towers are sort of goofy, and overall I just think it's a little bit too spacious, and I'm just not a huge fan of it. I don't really like the big plateau in the middle, but I've seen a lot of great games on it. And to me, whenever I think of Tal'Darim Altar, and this is when like not being in the replay itself and being able to go to certain areas to explain things sucks, but whenever I think of Tal'Darim Altar, right above the 4th base, the main base, the massive main base that IdrA has no vision over and he could easily be dropped on, is like a little cliff overlooking the 4th. And I just remember so many ZVTs I would watch where Terran would drop on that high ground, or even Protoss players, they'd send a Warp Prism up there and just warp in Stalkers and siege that high ground. One thing that I think is funny about StarCraft 2 maps, and one of the reasons that I like talking about them so much, is whenever you play on them throughout the years and on the ladder, they develop their own little flavor and like metagame within the map. And you could even be cute if you wanted to get esoteric and really in-depth and prove the point that like, and this is even more true even within servers, like there's a little bit different flavor on the Korean server than there is American, than there is European. That's a little bit esoteric, but the point still stands. There's a little flavor on maps, and what do I mean by that? I mean there's little strategies that people of certain races will like to do, and it's real racially divided. So, an example, earlier I was talking about that low ground push that Terrans would love to do at that natural. And there's a famous game where IdrA lost to Marine King, I think it was like at an MLG, where Marine King, who loves like little gimmicky spots like that, and timings and aggression, did this sharp little cheesy timing where he dug in on IdrA's low ground there and sieged tank up, and right when IdrA tried to clear it, the reinforcements from his close position base rallied in, and Marine King crushed him. That was really popular, and on this map, when you were in close positions, as a Zerg you had to know to look out for that. But if I just invited you to a game and queued you into this, you wouldn't think about that just naturally looking at the map and being like, oh well, if he spawns here, like this would be a really good spot for a tank push, or like he's gonna do this. Or back in this day, it was actually like a cutesy thing to open Reaper. It was like being bisexual or something. It was like, oh, he went Reaper, because you needed a tech lab, and they weren't laughably imbalanced like they were in 2010 IM Cologne when Moro beat IdrA in the finals. It was just like a really good scouting unit. And it's not like it is now in 2020, where it's this god unit that you can make without a tech lab that's going to scout anything, and there's pretty much no way to be caught off guard, and there's no reason not to make it, and you're a moron if you don't. See, like this is one thing that, like, if you're nostalgic, is actually way better. Earlier I said the games now are better, like they're certainly higher quality and the players are better and more consistent, and that's not debatable. But what you can debate are elements of, well, how does the metagame of this specific element of this matchup compare to what it is now? And to me, Terran openers are way more interesting than they are now, because back in this day you saw a nice variety of CC First, Marine Expand, and Reaper opener. Now it's straight Reaper no matter what, because the Reaper's too good. It's not too good in the sense that it was in 2016 when Beyond was at his peak and he was just like railroading people with 3 racks Reaper and outright winning. As we can see, IdrA going into Hive, going into Infestor, getting spawns down at that base I was talking about, and just doing some harassment with Ling Bane. But back in these days, the maps were completely different. They were just very crucial in terms of you had to sort of have a strategy for the different positions. So if you were Zerg and you were going into a big tournament game against a Terran, you had your like close by air and your cross position strat, but then God forbid you scout him early and like always close by ground positions. Like you're not really, unless your strategy was like an all-in, you're not going to be able to do like what you wanted initially. So a big Ling Bane army from IdrA, and he's just going to swallow this attack up. Pulse sieging, but it's that oh shit siege where you're already being decimated by a Ling Bane army. And the Thor retreats a little bit, but when you get caught off guard completely like that, and the maxed Zerg player slams into you from an angle that you weren't expecting, it's nearly impossible to win that fight. So IdrA kills the CC, that's really nice. If you can delay the Terran's 4th as you're teching into Hive and going crazy as Zerg, they sort of stall out, especially because of mules. But back in this time, the bases started with more money, so you didn't mine out as quickly. It wasn't significant, but it's worth noting. So IdrA is getting links here, and he's getting the Hive upgrades, which is nice. Starting his Greater Spire. I think it's worth noting that people forgot Adrenal like probably 60% of the time in this era. They forgot it so much, even the top Zergs. Any good Zerg player these days, any pro gamer, love this Muta Harass, by the way. They hotkey their eggs, so they have all their hatches on one hotkey, as we see IdrA does here, and then whenever they make units, they hit control and click the bottom and basically select all the eggs, and then shift click them and do their control group. So that way, as soon as the units are done, they come out into your army. And obviously you don't do this for drones, but you do this for all your other units. Back in this time, even like, remember, the game came out early 2010 and this is mid 2011, and Zergs are still just like IdrA, who is known for his like top tier mechanics, is just like making shit. Like he's churning stuff out of all of his hatcheries, and he's not hotkeying it like as the eggs. Obviously, like once the units come out, then he's using hotkeys. But it's interesting to look at like how much Zerg macro evolved through the years, as it looks like IdrA's going to get himself another Force CC, and if Polt loses this, it's going to be really hard to win, because IdrA's going crazy. And this is one thing about Tall Dream Altar: if you're Terran and you get behind, you're so far away, and Zerg's creep is so crazy that it's like feels like it's impossible to range out across the map. You know, I feel like this map is a little bit too big, because even when I'm Zerg and I'm way ahead and I have all my queens going and I'm just cooking with my creep spread, I feel like it's arduous to like creep the whole map and like be really obnoxious. I feel like it's a big pain in the ass to get it past mid-map. So I don't know. But with Infestors here, boom, as remember, these are Wings of Liberty Infestors, baby. And people hadn't really discovered how good these were, and they didn't discover that it was really important to rush up to them or how to do that, and it was way harder to rush up to a tier 3 unit on real small maps. As we see, IdrA has map control with overlords on the spare bases spewing creep as well as lings. This is essential Zerg players. But yeah, these are the Infestors that casted Infested Terran, which I guess is noteworthy only now because they changed it and replaced it with the joke ability. But most importantly, these were the Infestors that cast Fungal that's instant, aka it doesn't have a, as we've seen EMP go down there, but not on all of them. So the Infestor Fungal doesn't have a projectile, so as soon as the Zerg casts it, the goop is there. As we see, the Terran might try to run in, but Select does get fungled. IdrA had an Infestor in the back. He's going to dump all his excess energy infested Terrans out as the Broodlords ran down hell and the Mutas clear up the rest of the army, as at this point in the game, IdrA does not even want those Mutas. He wants to max out on tier 3. He's even made an Ultra Cavern just in case he wants to throw the game on expensive units. Select has tried to go into Ghost here. Now it is worth pointing out that around this time, Ghost play in late game TVZ was seen as exceptional for Terran and nearly unbeatable, but that was whenever both players are on even footing, when Terran's dropping and pressuring Zerg. IdrA has been crushing this game since about minute 10, or even earlier than that. These are the sort of games that IdrA likes to win. He deflects the first 2 pushes or aggressions, or just goes tit for tat with bases with his opponent, gets into his tier 3 units, and just focuses on his brute force macro mechanics. And we can see here he's building more Broodlords. And notice how he's continuously denied Select a 4th base. I feel like a lot of newbie Zerg players, as we see a Marine army venturing out to try to desperately save the 4th, as for God's sake, if he lost it for a 3rd time, he would just have to leave. And EMP all over the Infestors, which is really nice. The reason that Ghosts were so good, by the way, is because Snipe was ridiculous. It did like 55, but then bonus damage to massive, and both Broodlords and Ultras are massive, so it countered both of Zerg's tier 3 units, and Infestors, which of course were Zerg's backbone, as obviously we see IdrA is going to take the game because Select runs out of gas. And then Ghost counter Infestors too because of EMP, so it Ghost countered all of Zerg's late game. So we have game 5 here. And this one's going to be from IdrA's point of view. But remember, Select won with the Maka Racks, 2 Racks Bunker Rush in game 1. But other than that, he's really been having some trouble. He had the game on Zelnaga, where he managed to hold his natural and kill IdrA's 3rd, because right when IdrA was trying to break down the rocks, he attacked. You know, I'm not sure, and this isn't even a critical statement, but part of me wonders, like, how many times he does that push on ladder and that exact thing happens. Like, oh, he's breaking down his rocks for his third and like he's trying to take it and I'm gonna kill him. There's like a pretty good chance that happens. And then part of me just wonders if like, oh, like my stem's about to finish, like time for my attack, or like whatever the thing is, like my 2 medevacs are done, or like my 8th Hellion, or like whatever. Obviously, I'm not talking about that game specifically, but part of me wonders if you just did a random attack and like got really lucky, like, and part of me wonders if it was well timed out and like meant to break the third. But one thing that I think is worth noting in these IdrA vs Select games is, like I was saying earlier, Select was talking about how he was just so overmatched in their 2010 MLG DC meeting because there were no high caliber Zergs on the North American server. And this sort of reminds me of a really interesting quote that IdrA once said regarding his days of playing the Korean ladder right when the game came out in 2010 as he lived in Korea. He said that it was me and Cool, aka Fruit Dealer, 100 points ahead of everyone else on the Korean ladder up at 1 and 2. And keep in mind, guys, they were doing this when Zerg was at its weakest, when the map pool was Lost Temple, Metalopolis, Kulos Ravine, Steps of War. Delta Quadrant. These maps were some real atrocities. Part of what makes StarCraft so great is IdrA's going to scout here for 2 racks. He doesn't want to get bunkered in. Part of what makes StarCraft so great is you can actually go back and play these maps. Like these names that I'm dropping, all you have to do is go to the custom on StarCraft 2 and type the thing in, click on the map, create the lobby, invite your buddy, and have him play you Zerg versus Terran, and just experience what it was like. Like some of these maps, like Kulos Ravine, Delta Quadrant, it's insane how bad they are. And not just like, oh, they're bad for Zerg, they're like just really stupid, like in their design. Like, there's a high ground over your natural, like in both instances, by the way. It's just a complete disaster. There was a really famous, as we see, Lings are going to run up and scout reactored Hellion and kill some Marines, big deal. There was this like famous game on YouTube back in the early days of StarCraft, and it's interesting because back in the early days of StarCraft, part of what makes everyone like nostalgia facts so hard and say like, well, like the 2010 was better. And earlier I pointed out that like obviously the games weren't better, but like there were some things better about the 2010, 2011, 2012 era. There were constant high-level tournaments and lots of opportunity to make money for the pro gamers. StarCraft 2 streaming-wise was at the very top. CPM was super high, so the pro gamers were making a shitload of money just off of like your basic 30-second ad break. They didn't have a million invasive layovers and like donation messages or any of that bullshit. No one played behind a barcode. Everyone used the real ID or like a Smurf ID that like most people would come to know, and like, oh, this person is this ID. People miss that shit, and rightfully so, because that was awesome. People don't miss like the World War I hour-long TVTs from late 2010 where like people build 50 tanks and don't have any idea how to close games. Like people don't miss that. People don't miss like the really stupid force field abuse. I guess Protoss players might. I mean, I know that when I played Protoss, that 4-gate expand Sentry pressure build versus Zerg at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm was my favorite. So we can see that Hellions are containing IdrA. And because Roaches were so bad back at this time, IdrA doesn't really want to tech into Roach, because if you tech into Roach, you waste the gas that you need for upgrades, layer tech, banelings, and mutas, most importantly. And like because roaches don't morph into ravagers, it's a big waste to make a bunch of roaches. And then like you have roaches, and if they're walled in, you can't really do anything. You just don't want to invest in roaches, and it slows you down because of the gas. That's the main reason that roaches are bad. IdrA actually won one of his first tournaments in StarCraft 2, MLG DC, because I want to say it was like a few days before the tournament, the MLG, they did a patch where roaches got buffed, and it wasn't like ridiculous. It wasn't like they got buffed and then like everyone discovered they were imba and they had to tune them back down. No, it was like roaches were a fucking joke back in like the first 3 months of the official game release. They had like no range, they're fucking horrible. So roaches got like a slight buff to their range, which made a lot of like these like absurdly abusive like Protoss and Terran cheeses like way worse, like especially like the wall-in ones. And IdrA won the tournament that weekend. And because the tournaments were happening so frequently and they were really trying to balance StarCraft 2, it's not like now where the Blizzard like, oh, we're going to talk to the community and do this post and say like we're going to tinker with this and this is what we're thinking, and like we don't want to adjust this before a big tournament. There was way less communication those days, and because there were so many tournaments, they were just like, here's the patch, LOL, try it out. Whereas now, you know, you see way less patches, and a lot of the time, if a big tournament's coming up, Blizzard will consciously like not change the game that much. Obviously there's exceptions and they have to patch the game sometime, but back in this time, it was crazy. You could go into a tournament with next to no experience on a patch. And during the GSL, they would you would have to go, a lot of the time you would have to go through more patches, like, and it's interesting because a lot of, like if you look at 2016, Beyond just completely dominated that one of those GSLs in 2016 in that era, because the era perfectly fit him with the tank drops and the Reapers being really strong. But think about it, they didn't do a bunch of like major meta changing stuff for a very long time during that year. Whereas I wonder how long a player like Beyond would have lasted in an era where they were changing it more rapidly. Now what's funny is the Zerg of this era wouldn't argue that they were being slow, they would argue that they weren't changing the game rapidly enough. They weren't moving their feet to try to fix some of the more silly stuff. Blizzard wasn't. One of the main things that was stupid was the no rocks or neutral depot at the base of your main ramp. Because for like an entire year, you could do this ridiculous thing against Zerg, where you could wall them into their main base. This was usually done with 2 pylons and then a cannon behind it, and they like figured out that was just like pants on head retarded pretty quick, and made the base of walls like a pixel bigger. So then like Protoss players could still do it. It was still like laughably imbalanced, but it was a 3 pylon wall. And then Terrans could just make 2 bunkers. It was, I think, arguably better with Terran. Protoss, if you made your natural, they could cannon rush you by walling you in, which was annoying. But the thing about Terrans that was so good was like I was talking about earlier, salvage didn't cost anything. So you could throw up the 2 bunkers, and Zerg roaches sucked for a long time. You can't go into Ravagers, they don't exist. Are you gonna like make a bunch of Banelings? You're gonna tech all the way to Baneling, make enough Banelings on one base to blow like 2 bunkers down. And at any point, the Terran can just say fuck it and like walk away and salvage the bunkers. It was just a really bad time for Zerg. So eventually, like tournament runners just started using like slightly modded versions of ladder maps like instead of Cloud Kingdom LE Ladder Edition, it was ESW Cloud Kingdom. And basically the only alteration was there would be like a neutral depot at the base of the ramp. So like you couldn't wall Zerg in. And we see now that that's just standard practice on ladder maps. Blizzard finally got the message after 3 years or so that they should just add that little standard deviation to every map. Because the wall and shit was super corny and really imbalanced. And for the level of damage it did and how strong it was, it didn't take any talents at all. And whenever you consider what Zerg had to put up with in this time, really consider that there was like no Ravager and no Lurker. Because a lot of this seems like reasonable, or like a good player should be able to deal with this for the people who didn't have to play with it. But there were really very few options for Zerg at this time. It was very rigid and cutthroat, about till 2012, when one of the most important game-altering patches ever occurred in StarCraft. The Overlord and Queen change, where both the Queen and Overlord received significant buffs, and that was pretty much the start of the Infestor era. Because throughout the history of StarCraft 2, Zerg players have been pushed and pushed and pushed with different, as we see a big wing bane engagement potentially occurring, as IdrA wants to keep forcing Select's hand here. But Zerg players have been forced to adapt, is the point that I'm trying to make. So when 2012 rolled around and they could finally scout and defend adequately, they really discovered the power of the Infestor and how important it was to be able to use a lot of queens in their defense to get there. And IdrA's doing a lot of damage in the main of Select here. And at some point when you have a lot of mutas, especially with upgrades, you can say fuck it and fight the Marines. And that's really something that we don't, this is like a lost art. Because in Wings of Liberty, it was, like I said, more rigid, and the Zerg was often like, didn't have as many options and was more boxed in and like had to do the damage. And was more reliant on the muta, and it was harder to get to Hive Tech. So you saw a lot more like muta trading for Marines. And I'm not talking about like moronic, like people just like flying mutas in or like losing them for no reason because the game came out. I mean, honest to God, like I have 22 mutas and like you might have Marines stemmed over here, but you know what? They're only 1-1, and like you're running out of options if I stay in this main base. Sort of interesting. A lot of times in these matchups, especially on like the Steppes of War, Slag Pits type maps, close positions, Zerg would really be grabbing and scraping and clawing to get any advantage they could, and if they feel like they could break the Terran opponent or the Protoss opponent, then they would like sacrifice quite a few muta to try to do that. The one game I remember was IdrA vs MVP in the GSL on Steppes of War, like the best Terran map ever. Nobody thought that there was any chance that IdrA was gonna win, and he did, and like the killing blow was dealt because IdrA swung down and did a huge attack onto MVP and cleared his army, and then right as it looked like MVP was going to keep defending, IdrA ran everything in the Mutaling. And right whenever he did that, he brawled with everything, sacrificing about half of his Muta army. But then he defended. So IdrA wants to defend this exterior base. This is Shakuras Plateau. There's a lot of like mid-sized maps that got a lot of credit for being like quote-unquote macro maps. What they really were was like barely playable. Like Shakuras Plateau, Antigua Shipyard. What's that goofy map? Scrap Station. The maps were so rush-oriented and so small in the early days of StarCraft that you had maps that were like really not that good. Like if you look at the middle of this map, it's caked in choke points. The middle two towers are just, it's so choked out, and it has goofy rocks. There were actually two versions of this map. One of them was like really bad for Zerg, and just like it literally had a backdoor main, like if there was a really famous game where IdrA played Jinro on this map. It was the original version in January of 2011, where the bases, like the top left and top right bases, were connected via ramp, like backdoor destructible rock ramp, and it was like you could break it down and have that little center base, like 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock. But it became a common strategy that if you spawned in, like, if you were top and your opponent was top, or you were bottom and your opponent was bottom, you're of course never able to spawn vertically on this map, no matter what. That was never even a possibility. But if you're like horizontal close by air spawns, Terran would just break their own rocks and do like a 2-base tank push and like siege you from outside the rocks, and it was really hard to hold. But we can see IdrA is getting the Zerg God Army. He has Broodlord Infestor, which is classic, but he also has a little bit of Muta, some Lingbane. And here we have a lot of Ghosts, and they are sniping the Broodlords to ribbons. So when you have an army like this, you have to consider, when do I send my Lingbane in? Because if that all dries up, a lot of your shit's gonna die. And we can see IdrA's down to just 3 Broodlords here, and the snipe really does wonders. It's not like now where if you hit the Ghost while it's casting snipe, it gets disrupted. And like I said, it did way more. And at this time, EMP was better too. They ended up nerfing EMP because it was too good versus Terran, or versus Protoss rather. So Select is intelligently working around with the drop. They're just looking around with mutas, but they're getting sniped. So this is sort of quintessential TVZ. Once the Zerg maxes, like he's trying to get something done but can't, and then the Terran starts to walk around with the drop and raise hell. And there's always this sinking pit in your stomach as Zerg when you're like sort of maxed and you need to make something happen. As we see IdrA's trying to do that desperately here. He's going to send in the Lingbane, send in the Infestor, goop as much shit as possible, and throw out Infested Terran with the excess energy. Is when you have Infestors into Ghosts, they're going to get EMP'd, and that's what we saw here. And annoyingly, one Viking remains, and the Corruptors finally will come over. And presumably Select has been making stuff while this is going on, so IdrA can't really press because he doesn't have enough ground army. Look, see, this is what I'm talking about. Is Select is going to venture out here, and even though IdrA retreated instead of attacking, he's still going to be caught with his pants down a little. So the name of the game here is to just try to deny Terran a 5th base, and continue to try to make Broodlords and Infestors. But yeah, there were 2 different versions of this map, and IdrA played a really famous game versus General on the first one, and then they changed it. He also, by the way, played what in my opinion is like the best game of StarCraft 2 ever played. Unfortunately, it wasn't like a big tournament game, so that sort of takes points against it. But it's a game casted by Artosis, and for years it would be the game that I showed people to introduce them to StarCraft 2. It's IdrA vs MVP, arguably when both of them are at like their Wings of Liberty prime. And it's just like this 31-minute macro TVZ slugfest. And it's just everything that I like about macro TVZ, where both players really go back and forth. And we've seen a lot of elements of why I like TVZ in this game, but this was IdrA at his peak and MVP at his peak. I mean, these guys were arguably like 2 top 5 players for like a solid year. When you consider things like, especially in the GSL, when originally it was formatted just like a big tournament, there weren't like groups and stuff. It was way easier, and that was when IdrA was really peaking, like in early 2010, 2011. Because he had been good in Brood War like 2008, 2009, 2010. But we can see he's going to try to pick off a Thor here. And it's hard to attack into this because of infestors, but when you have this much Ling Bane, you can brute force your way in there. If you're going pure infestor broodlord like we saw earlier, is Select's army just getting trashed here? It can be tricky to encroach with the infestors because you'll get EMP'd, but if you make a bunch of Ling Bane like that, you can crush forward, obviously. And we can see here that IdrA, like, he's been diligently making stuff and his macro has been fine, but see how he had stuff like mid-map just sort of sitting there lazily? That's because he's not hotking eggs. And I'm not trying to rip him for it, but to me, like, hotking eggs is an essential step of Zerg macro. And it's interesting that it took even like top tier Zergs this long to catch on. And you might be saying, well, like, if IdrA was so good in Brood War, how don't they know to hotkey eggs? Well, you can't hotkey eggs in Brood War effectively. You got the tight control groups, and you can't really, it's not a thing in Brood War, you don't hotkey eggs. It's not something that's done. So you remember, people were practicing Brood War for 10 years and developing all these habits. Okay, I'm Zerg, I'm gonna have all my hatches pointed one way. I'll either camera hotkey or just like base click over the hatches, and then I'll just churn a bunch of shit out and it'll rally, and then like I'll hotkey it all like as it rallies out. Obviously people are gonna hotkey all the hatches together once they figure out they can do that, and then whenever all the stuff rallies out, they can just like control click, right, 50 lings, shift 1, 20 mutas, shift 2, like a few infestors, shift 3. Brood War is just so ridiculously hard. You can be really good at StarCraft 2 and go over to Brood War and just get embarrassed, because if you, this is true especially if you started with StarCraft 2. If you start with Brood War, you like get a lot of the brute force mechanics down and understand how it works and how to like work your way to a win. But if you start with StarCraft 2, you learn a lot of like correct habits, mind you, like hotkeying eggs and like multiple camera hotkeys and stuff like this, like how to hotkey spellcasters. But, like, it doesn't work in Brood War. So like core and like how to just like make stuff as Zerg with like the no multiple building select. The select GGs there, obviously IdrA was like way ahead. So IdrA is up 3-2 in this series. And if he wins this game, he will win this ASUS Invite tournament in 2011. Once again, thank you to StarCraft 2 POVs for letting me use these VODs. Link to his channel will be in the description. You have to be a really hardcore StarCraft fan to just like go back and watch like really old esoteric VODs with no commentary. So I hope that I was able to bring this exciting final series to more people, because there's commentary over it and all the games are back to back to back. Someone's more likely to watch it than just individual VODs. And obviously I'm not trying to knock the guy. His thing is uploading raw VODs, which is like very helpful and nice, and I appreciate and love it. But I'm just talking about your average Joe Blow viewer. Like your average Joe Blow viewer like has to have commentary to like really know what's going on, truly. Especially when you're talking about old maps and like rivalries and contextualizing stuff. I mean, is there anyone outside of Artosis that would have known all of the history between these two players and all these old little map innuendos? If you consider a lot of these old maps, not only were they bad for Zerg just at their core, but another thing that made them bad, along with the fact that Zergs could be blocked in at the bottom of their ramp, which I've touched on this already, but it needs to be touched on again, it's close positions. You could spawn close by ground positions where you would actually be closer rush distance wise to your opponent than you would be on Steps of War, which is just insanely brutal, like almost unfathomable. So there was always like a 33% chance that, okay, it's like you're a Zerg player, imagine you're a Zerg player in 2010. You've been training for hours and hours, you go to this tournament, you're so excited. First, you're playing as EVT, first map you draw, Steps of War. Like one of the best Terran maps ever. It's like so small, smallest Terran map ever. See that neutral depot? Nice. So, you lose the first game on Steps of War because it's like the best Terran map ever. You're like, alright. Second map, Metalopolis. Like, pretty good map. It's one we've sort of peaked at. It's a very common map. If you looked at most common maps played in StarCraft 2 history, or especially most like think about like most like views on the internet on a certain map, like Metalopolis might have it, like really classic popular. You can spawn cross positions Metalopolis and it'd be like a fair and balanced macro game, like what a Zerg wants. You can spawn close by ground and see what we saw in one of those earlier games, the first game on Metalopolis, where he did, or it was on, that was on Shattered Temple, where he did the Makarax, but since he spawned close by air, you can rally stuff down and do pushes and be at their front door pretty quick, and also do like a lot more low ground stuff. Like when you're in those positions, what you have to worry about more is them like sieging tanks down there, like running up on your low ground and pushing a front door and sieging shit. But also like banshees, and like when you face Protoss, like void rays and stuff, like obviously like, oh, a surprise muta attack, like that's the least powerful of all those options. So that sucks. And then of course like close by ground is like what you absolutely don't want to get. And eventually Blizzard disabled that. You can't even spawn in close by ground. And you could always still spawn in close by air. And then eventually it just got to a point where like every 4-player map that got made was like force cross. Or like it wouldn't be on the ladder, but on the tournament maps it would be like this map is force cross spawn. Which I think in Wings of Liberty it makes sense on a lot of levels, as 2 creep tumors die, but so does a Hellion. But Zerg was so boxed in and had so little tools to work with that I think you could really see the reason for a lot of these changes. I think it would be really interesting if you took Legacy of the Void and just like went back in time and dropped it in July 29th of 2010 or whatever, whenever StarCraft 2 was released. Like, you don't alter anything, all the pro gamers have the same knowledge they did in 2010, the same day it was released, but like it's Legacy. But you use the same map pool you did for like the first 5 years of the game. But it's like Legacy the whole time. And like you don't really patch it that much. You sort of tell the pros like pretend it's Brood War, LOL, we're not going to patch it. Like the point that I'm trying to make here is I wonder like how often Zergs would have been able to combat some of like the ridiculousness that they faced on these maps in this era with Ravagers specifically. To me, that's like the one tool that stands out as being like both really good offensively and defensively, because a big problem in this era for Zerg was, oh, a lot of people would always suggest, especially non-Zerg players, well, why don't you just make roaches to defend this? Like make a few roaches, or like bust out with roaches, or like just make a few safety roaches. Yeah, you have like 30 drones. Like just make like 7 or 8 roaches just in case. But yeah, like the thing is, if you make roaches and they're sort of useless, like the player didn't attack, or you have a bunch left over after an attack, or it seems like they're gonna hold your attack, you can make them into Ravagers, and suddenly you've turned like a completely dead investment that doesn't scale into something that has both like defensive and aggressive potential. So I really love Ravagers, and I'm really interested to think like, what if like Ravagers existed when like Lost Temple was in the pool, and like people tried to go tank drop, and like on GSL would Nesty have like come up with like a really sick build where he rushed out like 5 Ravagers right as like the tank drop was hitting, and like biled the tanks down that were in siege mode. A lot of me wonders about that, because if you look at like 2012 and the Broodlord Infestor era, and the era that, despite being like a very like fun time to like watch tournaments and go to tournaments as one was happening all the time, it was an era that a lot of people attribute to being one that sort of like made the game spike downwards in popularity. And I think that games, they're not like other things where people, they're not like sports or something where people will like come back to them and re-enjoy them. As you see IdrA kill a lot of Marines, but then he's forced to be pushed back. Like, in terms of actively playing a game as difficult and demanding as StarCraft, I think that a lot of people get like really into it for an extended period of time, and then what happens is they become really frustrated with a certain era or a certain meta or a certain point, and then they quit and never come back to it. And obviously you have the people that like aren't really that interested and are just shit and like never really play, but I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the people that would like actually try to like watch videos and get better. Well, I think it gets to a certain point where like if the game is like AIDS for like months and months and like really bad and not fun to play, and you lose like let's say like 5 to 10% of your player base, a lot of people will be quick to write that off and say like, well, it's just temporary, like people will come back after the patch. And like a lot of people do. But I feel like with the game as like demanding as StarCraft, and like there's no like ELO hell myth in StarCraft like there is in like MOBA games. Like if you're poorly ranked in StarCraft, or like your macro's bad and you float money and get supply blocked, it's a 1v1 game. You have no one to blame but yourself. And like that's hard on a lot of people, and it makes a lot of people not want to come back. Like if something is that challenging and people are struggling, and an era like Broodlord Infestor happens, or like in my opinion what was worse was like the Swarm host era in Heart of the Swarm, when like every ZVP and like very frequently like ZVZ and like ZVT versus mech, the best de facto Zerg strategy was like make like basically max on like Swarm host static defense and like a few spellcasters, and it was like the most cancerous, unfun thing to watch imaginable. And like people fall through the cracks. They stop playing. They fuck off to other games. And I think it's rare to have a person who like perseveres through a game through like almost a decade, like I and many other people have. And there's not many games worth doing that, and StarCraft is one of them, and that's part of why I like it so much. It's not like a gimmick flash in the pan, like bullshit little Fortnite thing that no one's gonna remember except for like meme value in a couple years. Like these games to me, they have historical impact, they're interesting, they show how the meta developed and how players were playing at a certain time period. And it looks like IdrA is massing up the Lingbane to try to move in for the killing blow. And Zerg players never really took the gold bases in the middle. Terran players would always try to and make it a PF. The Zerg players would always expand to the other mains. As IdrA's going to attack here, and he's going to do a lot of damage, killing some tanks, but a lot of Marines are going to scream forth as a cycle finishes here for Select. And IdrA was in sort of one of these weird positions when he fight against tank Marine with Ling Bane. As you see, IdRA's going to run in again with no Banes. He doesn't want to give Select any time to collect himself, but it's not going to work. IdrA doesn't really have like the oh shit number of mutas. Since he's not like hotkeying the eggs when they come out, he's working with like, or he was working with like about a dozen, and he only had about 15 when I said what I said. 15 is like the beginning of when mutas start to get scary, but in these like old school mutiling Bane engagements, as you see this army gonna get sandwiched from the south, IdrA just has so much vision with the tower and all this harass. Whenever you would get to like 20, 22 plus mutas, especially if you upgraded well, that's when it was like, well, the Zerg can now like fight armies to a certain extent, and when they come into your main, like they're gonna do real fucking festering damage real fast. Like shit is gonna get bad. You can no longer just deflect the mutas with like small groups of Marines. Like that's the amount of number of mutas when it gets really scary, is when like multiple turrets don't cut it anymore, like a dozen stem Marines don't cut it anymore, and IdrA's going to jump in here, and again he didn't have as many mutas attacking as he did total like made. And he's going to run into the third and kill a bunch of SCVs. So that's just classic StarCraft, is you attack someone in two different locations at once, and you sort of guarantee the fact that they're going to take damage from one. As there were some of the idle mutas, and more arrive mid-map, and IdrA has a lot of mutas. He's going to peek in, see, okay, he's making bunkers. This is a cute thing about Antigua, is people would make bunkers down here. And there's like 5 siege tanks here, so IdrA's going to lose all of his lings before they can attack anything and retreat. So like Antigua shipyard, once you sort of establish your third, some Terrans will just like set up shop down there. Protoss, it was more common to like split your forces between natural and third, and maybe like make some cannons by the little backdoor rocks at your third. To me, this was always one of the bases where it was like one of the maps where as Zerg you ask yourself, well, where am I supposed to take my fourth? But in reality, this was like one of the easiest maps to do that, because you always just, you take them like pretty much where IdrA does. You pretty much, if you want to take him in like the main base or the natural or the third of your opponent, and if it's Terran and he's top left, you don't want to take the main, because they can fucking show you, they can show your main from their third pretty much. It's ridiculous. So see the base where IdrA took, the bottom middle, that's way more defendable. Whereas if he were to take a base in the top right, he would take the main. Because he, like, you know, when you take bases, especially like on these old maps, or if you're trying to hide a base, you don't want to hide a base where like if Terran accidentally sees it, they can fucking load up and come kill it in 5 seconds. Like, you want your bases to be sort of out of the way where they can mine safely. Because remember, a lot of these games, Terrans are going to be queuing up drops, and they're going to be going around like the corners of the map and stuff. We can see IdrA sort of like ripping it in here, having a lot of mutas, and really fighting with the mutas to try to prove a point. And Thors, which at this time were pretty much the one-stop shop to stopping mutas, because they did splash damage, and still do splash damage to light units. So Thor tank out here for the Terran, and IdrA's going to run in, and it's the eternal dilemma for Zerg of what to focus in these engagements. Because on some level the tank just rips apart everything as we see a Greater Spire start, but on another level, like, the Marines and the Thors are what fuck up your muta, and if you can kill, basically if you can like isolate the tanks, it's cool. But the Terran no doubt is trying to take this gold, make it a PF, as we see a fungal go down there. And even with medevacs out, if you correctly space the 2 fungals, you will kill the Marines. So huge SCV transfer. The 4th is coming for sure. He's probably going to float it out. There it is. Okay, that's a CC, so I think that's actually his main. And we can see here IdrA's taking a couple more bases. One thing about going muta in this era is a lot of times it was hard to end the games, and you could be delayed getting your mutas, and then the Terran gets tier 3, and you're sort of fast teching up, and you're near maxed, and you're stuck with all these muta. So then there becomes a point where you'd be way more liberal with them, in terms of it's okay to lose them. But then you run into the disgusting dilemma of if you lose them all, you can get railroaded in your transition. Like right now, IdrA's trying to transition. Thankfully he didn't lose all the muta. But he has it planned out and timed out really well because his macro is exceptional. He's a pro gamer. What would happen to a lot of us is we would like max out on like Ling Corruptor and Fester with a few Banes and go to make the Broodlords, and the mutas would be there too. And then you don't have the supply to make the Corruptor into Broodlord, so then like you have to unceremoniously shove off supply. And IdrA just completely conquers this middle plateau that pretty much controls the whole map. And remember, IdrA's ahead here, 3-2. So if IdrA breaks this gold, Select is going to leave and IdrA will be crowned the champion. And he's going to fungal those SCVs, and that is absolutely brutal. A lot of them, they need another fungal to die, but I think IdrA wants to be up, bait out that army, have it run up, and the tanks are terrible against broodlords because they'll friendly fire your shit trying to shoot the broodlings. Broodlords are pretty much the counter to tanks, and because IdrA ran in unison, he could run in and kill a lot of the SCVs, but Select was so laughably oversaturated there, he might have been better off like playing the long con and just trying to get another 2 fungals down, because that would be like a 60 kill double fungal. Amazing. But if we look at the map here, IdrA has even managed to take a gold, and he has a plethora of corner bases, and we can pretty much assume that Select, I mean, he can really only have top middle, but I seriously doubt that since he floated off his main CC. A lot of times as we see huge links coming here and Select GG's, so IdrA wins the tournament. So just to conclude the Venomous Classic here, I just want to talk about how this is like the PF to end all PFs, right? If you're going to, so okay, see how he floats command center out here? Well, it dies because of the mutas, and like when you have this many lings, it can be really difficult for like Marines to like range out and attack you. Sure, like the tanks eventually cleaned it up, but IdrA killed the CC, so you know that he's not gonna float the main CC out to the 12 o'clock, which is like a legitimate worry in scrappy games. So once you kill like that, like it's 22 minutes in, and you killed his 4th, and it's not like you killed that PF a bunch of times, so you know the Terran's running out of money and he's desperate. But overall, like a well played series by IdrA, and he only lost 1 macro game in this series. And whenever the Terran transfers like 45 workers to 1 base, you're just like, wow, they're way behind. But you're also sitting here licking your chops if you're IdrA, because you have infestors and there's a damn high ground above it. And you're not going to do the Artosis neural parasite through mules Kulos Ravine strategy. You're going to fungal twice for 1 billion kills. I mean, they're like so oversaturated, it's insane. But anyway, that was the Venomous Classic. Sub for more.